Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen. This is me, Captain Fahad, and I'm back with the ever awaited series of preliminary report of PK-8303 Part 2. Thank you so much for appreciating my work in previous videos. So let's get right into from where we left because it's a lot to cover. And guys, before we continue, if you haven't watched the part 1, then I would urge you to watch that first and then come for part 2 so that the report makes sense and gets easy for you to grasp. So you're ready? I'm ready. Let's dive in. Okay, so point H. Since the approach to land was continued, Karachi approach, instead of changing over the aircraft to aerodrome control, sought telephonic landing clearance from the aerodrome control. The aerodrome control conveyed a landing clearance of the aircraft without observing the abnormality that the landing gears were not extended to Karachi approach. Subsequently, Karachi approach cleared the aircraft to land. Okay, guys, first of all, let me give you a slight insight about ATC controllers. There are three main type of ATC controllers. One is en route or the area controller, second is the approach controller, and the third is a tower or aerodrome controller. So, as the airplane approaches and flies through a center's airspace, an en route controller guides the plane along its route by using radar and computer technology. They can track the exact position of each aircraft flying in that airspace and adjust the flight path of aircraft to avoid collisions and for safety in general. And once the aircraft reaches the vertical limit of the jurisdiction of approach, it is then handed over the next control unit, that is an approach controller. Approach controller will further descend the aircraft, and at the same time it will guide the aircraft to align with the runway center line. They are responsible for when and where each aircraft should be, ensuring that the minimum separation is maintained between aircraft coming for an approach. Once the aircraft has descended sufficiently and is aligned with the runway center line, its control is then passed to the destination aerodrome tower controller, which then clears the aircraft for landing if the runway is clear. One thing more on this is that aerodrome controller are located at the highest place where the view of the runway and aircraft coming to land is visible to them. So as the aircraft lands, they can see them vacating the runway and then clearing other aircraft to land. So guys, just to summarize, area controller helps the pilot in their cruise phase and maintain the separation between aircrafts in cruise. The approach controller duty is to line up the aircraft with the runway for an approach and maintain the distance between the aircrafts, and mostly he is looking up on his radar. The aerodrome controller duty is to clear the aircraft to land on the runway which it is aligned for, and aerodrome controller is the one who is mostly visual and also looking for any abnormalities when an aircraft is coming in for a landing. For example, like if the landing gears are out or the runway is clear. Okay guys, so at this point I hope it has now been cleared about the duties of air traffic controllers. Let's look up what the report depicts. So when the flight PK-8303 was coming in for a landing, instead of switching it over to aerodrome controller, the aircraft stayed with the approach controller. The aerodrome controller passed the landing clearance to approach controller via telephonic conversation without even looking at the aircraft that their landing gears were not extended. Hence, the Karachi approach controller cleared the aircraft for landing, whereas the clearance should have been given by the aerodrome controller. But I believe that the approach controller didn't tell the pilots to change the frequency to aerodrome controller is just because I believe that the aircraft was very near to the runway and there wasn't enough time to hand off to aerodrome controller, so the approach controller took the clearance permission from aerodrome controller via telephonic communication and then instantly conveyed that to the pilots that they are clear to land. So as the point H is cleared now, moving on towards point I. So bear with me on this cause there is a lot going on here to grasp. I'll continue to explain as I go with the point. So the aircraft is down to 500 feet and cleared to land by the approach controller. The FDR indicates that the landing gear retracted. So as we know from the point F that the landing gears and the speed brakes were retracted by pilots at around 1750 feet, and we have no clue why. So flaps and slat configuration 3, airspeed 220 knots indicated, descent rate, my goodness, 2000 feet per minute. Well, um, don't have words. Well, the aircraft speed was way too high. So as the VSI speed, which is the rate of descent, that is 2000 feet per minute, while it should have been half of this or even less. They were way too fast at 500 feet. Honestly, it would have been a very uncomfortable descent for passengers and a roller coaster ride for pilots, considering the fact they were flying a jetliner rather than a fighter jet. Okay, so moving on further, according to the FDR and CVR recordings, several warnings and alerts such as overspeed, landing gear not down, which is too low gear, and ground proximity alerts were disregarded. The landing was undertaken with landing gears retracted. The aircraft touched the runway surface on its engines. My goodness. Flight crew applied reverse engine power and initiated braking actions. Oh my god. Okay. Both engines scrubbed the runway at various locations, causing damage to both of them, which is obvious. Okay, so despite of all the warnings, bell, whistles, chimes, aircraft telling too low gear at 1750 feet, the gears were still retracted. And even at 500 feet, the action of lowering the gear was not taken. And despite of all the warnings, the aircraft touched the runway on its engines. And the most important part is that the crew actually believed that they landed the aircraft normally on their landing gears, for which they applied reverse thrust power and initiated a braking action. And I believe that the braking actions which they are referring here is brake to the wheels, which were never deployed and were resting under the carriage of the aircraft. When an aircraft lands, its weight exerts onto its landing gears that puts the aircraft on ground mode. This activates the thrust reverse gate and deploys the ground spoilers if armed. The aircraft thrust reversal will not be operated until or unless the aircraft is on ground, and the way it senses that it is on ground is when the aircraft wheels touches the ground and has substantial weight to it. Then it allows pilots to apply reverse thrust that slows up the aircraft. So in this case, the pilots landed the aircraft without the landing gear, and FDR depicted that they applied the reverse thrust, but I strongly believe that the aircraft thrust reverse were not operated, as the aircraft had no sense that it has touched down because the landing gears were never extended and the aircraft never touched down on its wheels. And then they applied brakes to the wheels, which were never extended. I don't know what was going on in the cockpit, what they had been doing, and what was their intentions. Either they forgot to lower the landing gear, which is very, very rare because of continuous repetitive chime, or one pilot wanted to go around again. It's the captain who initiate a go around call. I don't know whatever it was. It's extremely abnormal and mind-boggling event. Only CVR can now tell what was happening in the cockpit at the time of final descent down from 1750 feet. And guys, yes, stop commenting that the pilots were suicidal, cause they were not. If they wanted, they would have never lifted the aircraft back up in air and had crashed the aircraft straight nose dive into Malir area, where the casualties would have been many. So, after that, both engines scrubbed the runway at various locations, and locations are mentioned in the CAA inspection report, one at 4,500 feet, other at 5,500 feet, and the thicker ones at 6,000 to 7,000 feet down the runway. Selected screenshots of CCTV camera footage shows the horrific scene of the aircraft touching down, and visible sparks are coming off due to the aircraft scrubbing. What a scene that would be for passengers. Okay guys, let's swiftly move on to the next part. The aerodrome control observed the scrubbing of engines with the runway but did not convey this abnormality to the aircraft. It was conveyed to the Karachi approach on telephone. Subsequently, Karachi approach also did not relay this abnormality to the aircraft. Okay, so at this point, the aerodrome controller, which I told you earlier that they are sitting where the aircrafts are visible to them, the aerodrome controller saw the aircraft scrubbing down the runway and conveyed this message to approach controller via telephone. This confirms that approach controller and the airdrome controller were sitting at different locations or might be far apart from each other. The key point here is that the approach controller also failed to convey this message to the pilots and failed to ask what was their reason to go around, why they executed a belly landing, how many souls were there on board, but nothing was asked. So at this point, the ATC controllers were well aware of the situation, what was going on. Okay, so the point K indicates the landing was discontinued and go around was executed. FDR recording indicates a brief action of selecting landing gear lever to down position, which was immediately followed by its movement to up position. So yeah, definitely they must have realized that they landed the aircraft without landing gear. So at this point, I believe that the first officer immediately lowered the landing gear lever down, but the captain ordered or the first officer himself realized that the aircraft is scrubbing on ground and the gears cannot be lowered. So the first officer must have pulled the lever to up position again. And this is what I think so far. Intentions to undertake another ILS approach for landing on runway 25 left was conveyed. However, shortly after the go around, both engines failed one by one. Ram air turbine RAT was deployed to power the essential systems. FDR data recording stopped during this time frame as per the design limitation. Okay, so again, I don't know why Airbus have put this design limitations to FDR to go off once the engine's electrical power cuts off, as I think they should keep on recording the data even if the engine power goes off. But now from this point there is no official data as the FDR stopped recording. The aircraft was unable to maintain required height. The aircrew declared the emergency situation that both engines were lost and transmitted a mayday call. Evidence from the wreckage indicate reasons for the right engine failure, which is again by scrubbing onto the runway, the right engine failed. However, left engine requires further explanation, and landing gear in extended position did not demonstrate any malfunction of the landing gear system. Sadly, the aircraft crashed about 1,340 meters short from runway 25 left. It was a slow speed impact with high angle of attack, with aircraft configuration indicating landing gears extended, slats at step position 1, and flaps retracted. The set configuration was ascertained and documented from the wreckage at the crash site, as the FDR data recording had stopped earlier. As I told you before, that this point there is no official data as the FDR stopped recording. So, seriously, guys, there's nothing important to this report now, honestly. If I continue, it will be a waste of time as there is nothing important ahead. The way forward is just a brief info regarding what is the next step, how they will analyze further down with their investigation, and so on. I will be just bragging on this and the length of the video will be increased. So let's come down to the summary and my thoughts, and let's look at the option the pilots had to save the aircraft. So there were a lot of options that had been overlooked by pilots, one being the most important and the obvious one was to take an orbit while the ATC controller was instructing them, but it was refused. Second would be if the ATC controller had ordered them to go around at the last moment, then it could have been saved. These were the initial options that would have definitely saved the aircraft before the accident could occur, as prevention is better than cure. I don't think so. It fits here. So sorry. But let's see now what could have been done after the aircraft struck on its engines. So as the aircraft struck and lifted off, according to the report, the aircraft's engines started to fail one by one, obviously due to scrubbing and taking full force of the impact. And once they lifted back up, they couldn't climb further to 3,000 feet, as it's not possible for an aircraft to climb at that altitude without engine's power. So they were instructed to turn left heading 110. At this point, the pilots had two options. Knowing the severity that engines have less or no power and it will not be able to glide all the way back to runway 25 left, he could have landed the aircraft on the same runway from which they had departed on the reciprocal runway of 07 right. Yes, he could have done that easily by giving ATC controller a mayday call and instructing the ATC that they are landing back to the runway 07 right, as they had lost engine's power and would not be able to make it back to runway 25 left. So, this option was also not initiated. Then there was another option, a very liable option, which I think was to land the aircraft to PAF, which is Pakistan Air Force Faisal Base, which is hardly 8 kilometers away from runway 25 left. If they were even halfway down the adjacent runway, they could have easily turned 180 degree and landed the aircraft at PAF Faisal Base, as the runway is wide enough and more than sufficient for an A320 to carry out its landing safely. But sadly, that option was also neglected and the normal procedure to land on runway 25 left was followed. So the normal procedure was to take a long turn to final, but the aircraft turned a lot earlier, which was then asked by ATC controller that appears to be turning left. At this point, the pilots aware the ATC controller that they are coming in direct and they lost engines, which they should have instructed a lot earlier when they were not able to gain 3000 feet when instructed. Well, you must be wondering now, all these options had been neglected or missed due to confusion and lack of decisions making due to all the systems failing on them and the CRC alarms were ringing in the cockpit. So, what's next, you may ask? Wasn't there any hope for survival, right? Well, there was one. Yes, one last, in a layman's terms, 50-50 survival chances, and that was to carry out landing without the landing gears at the last moment, or to even lower the landing gear while they were very near to the runway. That would also be a good option, but not preferable one. Let me take a little bit of your time to explain what happens when landing gears extend. When the landing gears are out, the parasite drag increases enormously. At sea level, the drag on the aircraft is significantly higher than the drag at high altitudes where an aircraft usually cruises. This is why an aircraft flies at higher altitude to save fuel and fly faster with very minimal drag that opposes the aircraft, saving time, fuel, and keeping the ride comfortable for passengers due to weather being stable at such altitudes. When an aircraft comes to a lower altitude, the drag starts to increase and you need more engine power to counter that drag. When an A320 is flying with its engines on idle, the air mode of Airbus is always producing some thrust when on idle. Hence, at idle thrust and landing gear retracted, the Airbus have glide ratio of 3 to 1, means 3 miles forward in distance while losing 1000 feet of altitude. When engines are flamed out, the engines itself is now an additional weight and also they are producing more drag. Hence, with both engines shut down and landing gears are retracted, the glide ratio comes down to 2.5 to 1. And once the landing gears are extended while the engines are flamed out, the glide ratio comes down to 1.8 or 2 miles to 1, means 1.8 miles of forward distance for every 1000 feet. So the landing gears are made to bear the load of aircraft. They are huge in size and they aren't very aerodynamic. Hence, once lowered, it produces huge amount of drag that in turn reduces the airspeed of an aircraft. To counter that, engine power is required. If you don't have engine's power available, then you must have enough altitude to convert that potential energy into kinetic energy, and hence we trade speed with an altitude. If you don't have altitude, then the last option to keep the aircraft aloft is angle of attack. That also increases drag once increased. They all require thrust. The drag exert on aircraft at mean sea level, the angle of attack, the landing gears generated drag. To counter that, it requires thrust. Hence, the flight PK-8303 had no engines thrust, had no altitude, and the last mistake the captain or the first officer did was to lower the landing gear. That in turns increased the drag, and in the hope to save the aircraft, they tried to increase the angle of attack of the aircraft that further stalls the aircraft and the aircraft crashed. Maybe, just maybe, if they had not extended the landing gears, thus the aircraft would have barely made it to the runway. If not, then it would have crashed somewhere short of runway 25 left, and that would have saved some life, if not many, as the aircraft would be near the runway and the airport emergency services would have been easily accessible upon impact. The disaster of flight PK-8303 could have easily been avoided if the orbit was taken initially, and even after the failed landing attempt, the pilots had enough options to save the aircraft. If the aircraft had traveled such distance and crashed only about 1,340 meters, then it could have been landed on the reciprocal runway of 07 right or at PAF vessel base. This is what I think, and this is what pilots had. If any one of the given options had been selected, perhaps the lives on flight PK-8303 could have been saved. At this point, the report is concluded, and I have nothing more to say except to say sorry to the families of deceased flight PK-8303. I made this video for the general public to understand who does not belong to aviation background, and I hope I tried my best to educate you on the matter of aviation and also on the various aspects of aerodynamic and aircraft while going on with the report. Yes, the video was detailed, but it took me a lot of time to make, as good things take time, and I believe quality over quantity. So I hope you learned a lot. Kindly subscribe my channel if you like. But before you subscribe, I would like to tell you that my channel is not regarding an aviation, it's more towards a general entertainment channel. And I also bring some info regarding aviation time to time. So for those who will leave today, I wish you best of luck and thank you for visiting my channel. I am happy to educate you on this topic. And for those who will subscribe and go along with me, I would say welcome to Captain Fahad channel, and I hope the next content, whatever it will be, it will surely entertain you. At this point, I want to thank my subscribers, especially Jennifer Santos, Joel Gerard, this is the name I guess, Aisha Khan, Tim Carey, Ghazal R, and Muhammad Sufi. Thank you so much for appreciating and boosting my confidence to make such video. Thank you so much again. Like this video if it helps. And this is Captain Fahad. I'm signing off. Take care and Allah Hafiz.